You know, the difference between a forest planner and an urban planner, I found, is that forest planners believe that there's these inanimate objects out in the forest called trees that they can make do whatever they want. I actually found there were forest planners in Idaho that were predicting they could grow trees to be 650 feet tall. The tallest trees in the world are 300 feet tall. The tallest trees in Idaho are about 250 feet tall, so that was a rather outlandish prediction. Urban planners believe that there are these inanimate objects in cities that they can make do whatever they want called people. And I think the urban planners are just as erroneous as the forest planners when it comes to people. Now, I work for the Cato Institute, and my title for the Cato Institute is Official Train Nut. I love trains. I've ridden thousands of miles on Amtrak, hundreds of thousands of miles. I helped restore the steam locomotive, which is the second most powerful operating steam locomotive in the United States, and I believe in the world. I once owned 5 passenger cars that were restored to operate with this locomotive. My house is filled with railroad memorabilia. I'm also a cycling nut. As Steve mentioned, I ride thousands of miles a year. I particularly like riding in the mountains because I used to like going downhill. Now I like going uphill. Now that I'm over 50, going downhill doesn't have the thrills because you have a better idea of the consequences of an abrupt stop. But I do like going uphills a lot. And so you'd think I'd support the ideas of smart growth, which a lot of which are based on getting people out of their cars and on the trains and bicycles. So I started doing research for this book, Gridlock, and I realized that America is on the verge of a new transportation revolution. And that revolution is going to have just about as much of an impact on mobility and our economy as past revolutions like the automobile and the train and the streetcar. That revolution is not going to be high-speed rail, contrary to what President Obama wants you to think. It's not going to be light rail or streetcars. It's going to have to do with personal transportation rather than collective transportation. To understand why, I want you to think back 200 years to what transportation was like in 1810 and 100 years to what it was like in 1910 compared with today. In 1810, almost nobody had ever traveled faster than a horse can run and lived to tell about it. And the most recent land-based transportation innovation at that time was the stirrup, which was at that time over 1,000 years old. And yet, over the next 100 years, we saw at least five incredible transportation revolutions. The steamboat, the canal, the steam-powered train, the safety bicycle, and the electric streetcar. Each of these revolutions caused huge impacts on our economy. They made it possible to cheaply move freight and people around far faster and at far lower cost than any previous transportation system. And yet, by 1910, most Americans had no more personal mobility than they had in 1810. The reason for that is that steamboats and canals and trains were mainly about moving freight. And to the extent that they moved passengers at all, the fares were still too high for most Americans to pay. The streetcars were about, and bicycles were about urban areas. And in 1910, most Americans still lived in rural areas, and even in urban areas, a lot of Americans were factory workers who did not earn enough money to take the streetcar. And so they were confined to living in high-density housing within walking distance of their factories. So the vast majority of Americans were no more mobile in 1910 than they were in 1810. Mobility was democratized when Henry Ford developed the moving assembly line for building his Model T Fords. He doubled worker pay and cut the cost of his cars in half, making it possible for the first time for factory workers to buy the cars that they were making. And this led to an incredible increase in personal mobility. By 1925, passenger travel by automobile exceeded all other forms of travel combined. Today, the average American travels almost 19,000 miles a year, and 85% of that is by automobile. That's had huge benefits for America. For one thing, after adjusting for inflation, per worker incomes have increased 7 times. And I estimate that around half of that is due to the mobility provided by the automobile, because the automobile gives employers access to a much more highly skilled workforce, and so it increases worker productivity and worker pay. The automobile also made it possible to dramatically increase home ownership rates, because factory workers who previously had to live in apartments were able to go out to the edge of town, buy cheap land, and build their own homes. Between 1940 and 1990, the home ownership rates increased from 40% to almost 70%, and all of that was due to the automobile. The automobile made it possible for people to get all kinds of low-cost consumer goods. In 1910, the average American grocery store had only 300 items on its shelves. Today, the average store has 30,000 items on its shelves, and many have over 100,000 different food products available for sale, meaning anybody today has access, any American today has access to foods and other consumer goods that even the wealthy didn't have access to 100 years ago. The automobile brought us much better emergency services and greatly increased the social and recreation opportunities available to people of almost all incomes. And despite all of these tremendous benefits, there are people who say we drive too much. There are people who want us to reduce our driving. Leading the charge is Secretary of Immobility, Secretary of Transportation, Randal Hood, who said it's the goal of the Obama administration to coerce people out of their cars. He later amended that to lure people out of their cars by providing trains like light rail, the Phoenix Light Rail line, or commuter rail. But this is not going to work, and I'm going to explain to you why. This is the commuter train in Dallas-Fort Worth. It cost $500,000. It carries less than 5,000 round-trip riders a day. It's so expensive, it would have cost less to give every single one of those round-trip riders a brand new Toyota Prius every other year for the next 30 years than to run that train. This is a Music City Star, a train in Nashville, Tennessee. It carries only 500 round trips a day. It would cost less to give every one of those 500 commuters a new Toyota Prius every year for the next 30 years than to run that train. This is the West Side Express, a Portland commuter train, again, as expensive as a new car every year for the next 30 years. That's the problem, is that previous transportation revolutions were successful because they lowered the cost of transportation. In trying to get people out of their cars, they're not only trying to get people out of a very convenient mode of transportation into something that's inconvenient, they're trying to get us out of cheap transportation into something that's very expensive. Last year, Americans spent an average of 22 cents a passenger mile driving their cars. 22 cents. There were subsidies to driving. I don't think there should be any subsidies. I think we should get rid of the subsidies, but there were subsidies, and they added up to less than a penny a passenger mile. So total about 23 cents a passenger mile. Compared to that, mass transit cost an average of 90 cents a passenger mile, 70 cents of which is subsidized. Light rail, you can see the average is $1.80 a passenger mile, all but about 20 cents of which is subsidized. So we're trying to get people out of low-cost, convenient transportation into high-cost, inconvenient transportation. That's not going to work.